following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners on Saga 960 AM and those listening around the world on streaming and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana Kerzner, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for practical advice for everyday problems using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. This episode, we're doing a primer on core values. So no interview, no specific questions from specific callers. Core values, square one. Regular listeners know that one of my top 10 phrases is core values are more important for relationships than common interests. And the most common question, hands down, that I've received about core values is, what are they? To quote the great sage Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, well, alrighty then. Okay, we start at the beginning. Core values are your highest priorities and your most deeply held beliefs. And then I get asked, yeah, but what are they? Oh, righty then. Examples time. Yeah, this is why we're doing a primer. Let's go with the core value of honesty. Most people agree that honesty is, in the abstract at least, important. But that tells you nothing about that person's relationship to honesty. Those can be very different. I'm channeling my Jim Carrey tonight. We're going to use a Dungeons & Dragons system to separate the different relationships with honesty, all right? Good people can disagree on the judicious application of honesty. In fact, it's judicious. It's very easy to do. Apparently, much easier than saying the word judicious than to disagree on the concept of honesty. Some people think it's important to tell the truth whenever you can, even when it'll cause you problems, because it's the right thing to do. Those people are referred to in D&D as lawful good people. Then you've got the people who believe that telling the truth is a tool, and sometimes it's better to lie in the service of getting the outcomes you think are right or fair. Those people are called chaotic good people. Notice lawful good, chaotic good, both types of people are good people. They generally live in kindness and not taking advantage of others. But a lawful good person is going to find a chaotic good person dishonest, and a chaotic good person is going to think that a lawful good person is a chump. Now, why does this matter other than, getting along? We tend to dismiss people who have different core values from us as bad people, instead of seeing them as good people with moral codes that aren't quite the same as ours. And I see this all over the place, hence the primer on core values. Now, D&D teaches us that there are evil people. Not everybody who disagrees with you is a good person. And they come in different forms too. I should say, not everybody who disagrees or agrees with you is a good or bad person. A lawful evil person uses structures to maintain a power dynamic that benefits them. So, a lawful evil person will put on the appearance of believing in honesty, but they'll twist things to maintain the status quo or rise through the ranks. You know, those people that technically tell the truth, but they omit things so it's misleading. Yeah, that's lawful evil people. Then there's chaotic evil characters. Chaotic evil characters just lie because it's fun. Obviously, you don't want to confuse a bad person for a good person. It's really easy to do if you're not aware that good people can have different morals than you that are different, but they're equal. They're still morals. They're still a form of goodness. Similarly, people can like the same stuff as you and want the same things as you, but they don't want them for the same reasons. They don't want them for good reasons. They want them for actively bad reasons. And those people are not going to be someone that's going to be good for you. That's why I say core values are more important than common interests. For instance, I'm a fan of a lot of really violent TV shows, video games, movies. I like those anti-hero shows or, shows that have outright villains. Stuff like The Punisher, Westworld, The Boys. But I'm very careful about making friends with people based on those interests. The reason might be obvious. I like these shows because they use heavily flawed or outright bad people as characters to challenge the permission structures people use for what they do. But some people like these shows because people get rewarded on them for doing awful things, at least in the short term. That's not me. The Thanos was right crowd can stay away from me. Thank you. Understanding core values makes you a better judge of people. It helps your decision making. It makes it easier to productively communicate. Generally, it makes you less of a jerk. Jerk was not the word I wanted to use there. It's also important to understand core values so that people can't manipulate you through your core values. Case in point, the only time people tend to hear about core values outside of a religious community is through corporate mission statements, and those are designed to manipulate. Big corporations deep down, or maybe not so deep down, really only care about making money. That's their true core value. Any other stated value is something they do because they think it will help them make money. Sure, the people who work for those corporations may legitimately believe in things. And there are no completely good or bad people. We all make compromises and let ourselves off the hook on things we shouldn't sometimes. But a very costly mistake a lot of people make is confusing seeing the good in someone for proof that someone is a good person. It's that whole Hitler loved dogs thing. Why did Hitler love dogs? Because they were loyal. Dictators love loyalty in other people. And that's the difference between a good person and a bad person. It's not what a person claims to believe. It's whether a person holds themselves to the same standards they set for other people. I'm sure a lot of you thought of Donald Trump when I mentioned loyalty. There's a shining example of a guy who demanded loyalty in other people, but would throw anyone else under the bus, including his own kids, to save himself. If someone isn't willing to live by the values they claim to believe in, it's really not a core value. It's a manipulation tactic. Now, we all fall short of our own standards sometimes, but good people at least try to be consistent. Bad people, on the other hand, make rules for other people that they don't apply to themselves. More on that in a bit. Right now, I want to circle back because the third most common question I get on core values is, how do I know what mine are? And this is why I talk about superheroes so much. Your favorite superhero tells you a lot about your core values. Growing up, I absolutely loved Beast from the X-Men. Beast, the blue guy, the furry guy. Yeah, loved Beast from the X-Men. He was smart. He read poetry while hanging upside down, and that was cool. Beast was kind, he was even-tempered, and he didn't become bitter no matter how many times he was rejected by the world. The whole idea of the X-Men was a group of heroes who helped the world even though many people hated and feared them. Where the heck did that core value go, huh? Think about how many people justify hatred and cruelty by saying, well, they were cruel first. Yeah, I don't get along with people like that, maybe because I grew up with X-Men. This works with characters that are typical superheroes too. I brought up the show Westworld before. Westworld's a shining example of a show that has characters that embody states of being. One character named Dolores Abernathy, the one played by Evan Rachel Wood, she's defined by this quote. Some people choose to see the ugliness in this world, the disarray. I choose to see the beauty, to believe there is an order to our days, a purpose. That's a pretty classic example of a core value. Believing that life has purpose and that conscious beings have the ability to choose how they perceive the world. Now, Dolores is essentially a tragic heroine with some complications, but great villains can teach us things about our core values as well. The Man in Black on Westworld is an example of how easy it is for privileged people to go bad. The Man in Black's a metastasized sense of the natural order of things, believing that people are either predators or prey. He only sees the ugliness in the world. He's terrifying because we know there are people like that in the world. And that's the way villains can be useful. You know, villains can be positive. They remind us of our weaknesses. They're cautionary tales. Or at least they should be cautionary tales. Sadly, villains in media these days tend to be better developed than heroes. And that's a sign of the type of people who are creating the content. But a well-written villain is a good reminder that just because someone has their reasons for doing something, that doesn't make that something right or moral. Good decision-making comes from making logical decisions based on observations, in accordance with our core values. Therefore, core values are essential to rational, reasonable decision-making and happiness. Now, abuse strips us of our connection to our core values. That's why we lose sense of who we are as people when we're abused. Abusers make us say and do things and suffer through things we know are wrong, at least on some level. That's why the shame and guilt of abuse lingers for a very long time after the abuse stops. And that's why it requires active steps to heal from abuse. The other thing about abuse is abusers often manipulate our core values precisely to break us. That's why we feel weak when we're being abused and after we've been abused. And sometimes our families, our social groups, our workplaces, our schools, our greater society instill core values in us that make us easier to manipulate that way. And we're going to take a look at that after the break. If you have a question about core values or anything else, you can give me a call and leave a message at 289-275-9600. That's 289-275-9600. Or you can email me at liana@notherapyshow.com. That's LIANA @notherapyshow.com. Or send me a social media post at notherapyshow on Twitter and Instagram. I'm being whimsical about social media because social media has been cray-cray lately in the bad cray-cray kind of way. We're going to go to a break. We will be back. It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana Kerzner, not a therapist, talking core values. Back in a bit. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy, talking core values, the things in life that are most important to us. I'm Liana Kerzner, still not a therapist, yada yada. An understanding of core values includes understanding how core values, like I said before the break, can be used to manipulate us. And that's what makes it so hard sometimes to find the line between tough love and abuse. Which is which, right? It's often really hard to tell. So I'm going to use an example of an organization that uses core values, different types of the same sort of organization, and show you how little subtle differences can make a huge difference. We're going to talk about the military. Military organizations spend a lot of time refining and promoting core values. Because it's so deliberate, it's really instructive to see how these values differ between different military organizations. You might be surprised to hear that even though there's a lot of overlap, there are big differences between the core values of the Canadian military and the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army lists these as core values: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, integrity, and personal courage. Now, the Canadian military, the DND, lists loyalty, integrity, and courage as well. So those three are the same. But the Canadian military's list is completed with stewardship and excellence. Now, the first thing that jumped out to me with that is there's no specific reference to selflessness in the Canadian Services Core Values Code. Canadian soldiers are supposed to put country before themselves, but putting something before yourself is not the same as being totally selfless. That may seem like a small difference, but there's nothing small when it comes to core values. Now, everybody knows the U.S. military has a lot of might, right? It's huge. The sheer amount of money and people and resources that go into the U.S. military is unmatched. But Canadian troops are praised around the world for the quality of our individual soldiers. While the U.S. military stresses duty, the Canadian military stresses stewardship. While the U.S. military stresses honor, the Canadian military invokes excellence. And these are not the same values. Overall, it can be the difference between be a disposable grunt because that's what it means to be honorable, and you're guides who can make things better. And you're going to have to hand this off to someone, so don't break it while you're holding it. The other interesting thing about the U.S. Army core values is that you could argue that honor and integrity are basically the same thing. They're not. But honor has become a deliberately fuzzy word. It's sort of a thing that invokes a feeling as opposed to a specific definition. Integrity is about trustworthiness and incorruptibility. Honor is more about standards. The idea that you behave as if what you're doing actually matters, and so you do what you're doing well. Now that's, people are like, wait, that's not honor. Exactly. Honor is one of these gut words that is really hard to define with a descriptive definition. Now, there are plenty of U.S. veterans who absolutely went above and beyond serving their country. I don't want to cast any doubt on that. People give it their all and they come back and they're not treated very well. Now, part of the reason, and this is pure opinion here, part of the reason I think the U.S. armies don't necessarily treat soldiers well when they come back is because their core values definitively prime a soldier to be seen as a disposable cog. The Canadian military instead sees an enlisted person as a steward. It's the difference between emphasizing sacrifice and emphasizing caretaking. Now, you could argue that that's because the Canadian military has so very many fewer soldiers. And you'd be right. But still, these are generalizations. This is speculation to make a point about core values. Apologies to the U.S. Army. We're dealing with the idea of selflessness here. And selflessness is possibly the most controversial core value of all time. Altruism versus whatever you want to call it, rational egoism, self-preservation. This stuff has been battled out in philosophy for centuries. We talk about this stuff a lot on this show when I do these primers, because I think it's really important to understand where these things come from. The term altruism was likely coined by a philosopher named Auguste Comte. Comte was also a founder of sociology, the thing you get a degree in, right? Comte believed that laws exist to govern human behavior, as opposed to laws enshrining rights and freedoms for individuals. Now, this informs Comte's view of altruism, which was, well, to be blunt, it was both nuts in the bad way and sexist. Comte believed that women were inherently more altruistic than men. And altruism was good because it created an individual enmeshed in a society that ran scientifically. Now, of course, it's impossible for a society to run in a purely scientific manner, and trying to do science with society leads to highly punitive reactions to anything perceived to be aberrant. Enter the much maligned Ayn Rand. What? We're talking about Ayn Rand? Yes, we are. Hear me out, okay? Ayn Rand, philosophy's mother of dragons, who broke the wheel of philosophy, keeping women in their place via the concept of inherent virtue and the glory of motherhood, because altruism. Simone de Beauvoir, before Ayn Rand, tried to be an innovator in this way, but de Beauvoir, ironically, had the sense of self-preservation to never call herself a philosopher. She referred to herself as merely a student of Jean-Paul Sartre. And de Beauvoir adapted existing concepts in very smart ways, but she was careful. Whereas Ayn Rand just told Simone de Beauvoir to hold her beer, and Ayn Rand just said, all of you are just wrong. Now, Rand adopted an old school nihilism concept, rational egoism, but she torqued it in a way that made people lose their minds to this day. She called it rational selfishness. Few concept in philosophy has drawn as much fire as those two words. Even the philosophical concepts that form the moral permission structures for slavery are seen in higher regard by most than the words rational selfishness. When people hear rational selfishness, they tend to lose sight of the rational part, because selfishness screams at them like a trumpet blast to the face. We're raised to believe that selfishness is bad. Always. Except, every time you get in an airplane, you're told, in the event of an emergency, put on your own mask before assisting someone else, right? That, in a nutshell, is rational selfishness. And yet we don't think of it that way. And that's partially because the official definition of rational selfishness sounds really bad at first read. This is the official definition, okay? The principle that an action is rational if and only if it maximizes one's self-interest. In fact, acting against one's self-interest is considered, under rational selfishness, to be immoral. Now, don't knee-jerk here, okay? Like I said, it sounds bad. But there's a reason this idea came out of Russia and the communists buried this idea, okay? Which was probably, of course, part of the appeal to Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was herself a Russian immigrant to America. And she knew that nationalist movements like the Soviets, the Nazis, U.S. white supremacist groups, these groups emphasize sacrificing oneself for a greater cause as the height of morality, because that cause is so important, right? Now you're probably thinking, yeah, they aren't the only ones that do that. This concept of giving yourself to a higher calling or a higher purpose, or being supportive, helpful, help the whole, is drummed into the mind of almost every little girl raised in this world. Be helpful, be supportive, don't be selfish. But then there's the whole women and children first messaging aimed at men, right? It's that whole enmeshing the individual with society that Comte wanted. So what happens? People don't learn self-care or boundaries. People get taken advantage of their entire life, and people end up chronically miserable. Rationally selfish thinking can produce the exact same results as an altruistic framework, but the attitude of the person doing this thing is completely different. Let's take the idea of parents sacrificing for their kids, right? You can sacrifice for your kids because of a hardline moral belief in altruism, that suffering is an indication you're doing it right. See how that goes. Or you can think of sacrificing for your kids as giving your kids all the things you didn't have that would have made you happier growing up, which is how most people explain it. And if you think about that, that's actually a selfish impulse. But it's a rational selfish impulse. Rational selfishness, practiced consciously, prevents irrational selfishness, the stupid, short-sighted things we do that completely mess up our own lives. Now remember, this segment of the show on core values is about how to prevent yourself from being manipulated via your core values. So give me a bit more time here, okay? Because I want my parents to be unhappy every day of their lives so I can have a PlayStation 5, said no properly raised child ever. But a lot of parents spend ridiculous hours at the office to make money for these sorts of things, only for them to get lonely, cheat on their spouse, and ruin their marriage. Unless a kid totally hates their parents, that kid would rather their parents be together, even if it means they don't have the latest video game system with almost no exclusive games on it. I say this is a PS5 owner. The point of view of the kid is rational, right? And yet, so many parents screw up their lives in exactly the way I described, so that their kids can have what they believe to be the best of everything. And the best of everything usually means like furniture from Pottery Barn Kids. And again, if you think about it, that's irrationally selfish. Kids don't give a you-know-what about, how expensive the furniture in their room is. That expensive furniture is a status symbol for their parents. When I talk about happy math, this is what I'm talking about. Minimizing irrational and therefore stupid selfish actions by making rational, self-validating choices sooner, even if someone calls you selfish for doing it. Oh God, you'd rather catch up on sleep than go binge drinking with your friends because you're run down tired and you don't actually like binge drinking. How selfish. Not really. It's your friends who are being selfish. They're manipulating you by calling you selfish. But I think everybody who has a group of friends like that has had that, manipulation tactic played on them. And here's the truth here. The urge to call someone selfish is usually selfish. Because people know to greater or lesser extent that they're hitting that core value of selflessness, right? We think that's a good thing. And because that's such a universally accepted good thing or near universally accepted good thing, people use it to manipulate. Now, Ayn Rand didn't express herself in the most palatable way. She was far from a perfect human being, and her followers really tarnished her legacy with some profoundly bad behavior. But the core principle is useful. Sometimes doing the thing that feels good in the short term maximizes your self-interest and is therefore rational. Other times, delaying gratification and making sacrifices for the long run, that maximizes your self-interest. And that's the more rational choice. If you don't see yourself as having any intrinsic worth because you're so afraid of being selfish, you can't make those choices in your own best interests. People who think they're being altruistic because it's something to aspire to often end up being horrible to other people because they're so busy suffering to show that they're good people. They don't see how their misery is making them say and do terrible things. Miserable people are not their best selves. Most of them have been manipulated into believing that if they do things the proper way, they'll be rewarded. And when that reward never comes, they end up bitter. And that's where we're going with the core values thing and manipulation. Bitterness, like abuse, separates us from our core values. Bitterness is a mind killer, man. That's why I say top 10, healthy goals are based on things you can control. Every person can only handle so much disappointment. Wanting to help other people is a wonderful core value. So is wanting to give back to the community. Or the people that raised you, or so on and so forth, right? But personal strengths and weaknesses don't work like super strength and kryptonite. Often our super strength is our kryptonite. And the key to making our core characteristics and values more strengths than weaknesses is to understanding the selfish core of the driver. Take my affinity for Beast from X-Men, right? Growing up, I was a weird kid. Like, really weird. I'm a weird adult. But as a kid, I might as well have had blue fur and fangs based on how people treated me. And because of how bad that felt, I didn't want to be the reason anyone else felt like that. Kindness was and is a core value of mine. See how that's a mix of selfless and selfish impulses? For me, that got out of balance. I ended up being too easily controlled by people telling me no one wanted to be around me or work with me. And then on top of that, the desire to make other people never feel as bad as I felt. And this is when I realized if you're primed to believe in selflessness, it's easy to fall into that pit of double whammies again and again and again. You know, I feel bad, so I don't want to do it to other people, but because I don't want to do it to other people, I just take on more and more and more and feel worse and worse and worse, right? If you wonder why you always seem to attract manipulative people, users, people who aren't good for you, consider a bit more rational selfishness. Just a bit. Because it's irrational to let people continue to manipulate you. Now, I had to change my relationship with the core value of kindness to make it work better for me. I had to change the stories that I told myself that had that core value as the moral. Top 10 phrase, don't let problems that aren't your fault lead to mistakes that are. So how did I do that? How did I make those changes? I'm going to get into how core values can be used to make positive changes after a break. If you want to ask a question, if this has inspired you to make changes in yourself, 289-275-9600, leave a message or email. Email admit is preferred for me because I can listen with my eyes multiple times before I respond once. Liana at notherapyshow.com. That's Liana at notherapyshow.com. Or if you're in the car and you can't remember that stuff, at Not Therapy Show on Twitter and Instagram if you want to get in touch. Be back after a quick break on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We are back on It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana Kerzner, not a therapist, but we are talking core values. And before the break, I said, after we came back, we were going to talk about how to use core values to make positive changes. And I am going to be good on my word. Nobody's perfect, right? We all want to do better. But self-improvement, to put it lightly, is hard. It can be confusing. You can feel really lost. You want to give up when you put all this work into doing better, only to find out that you didn't do better. You just did different. Again, right? When we make the same mistakes or similar mistakes over and over, it's because those mistakes are giving us something, even as they make us miserable. A lot of the time, it's a misguided validation thing. We want to be consistent. We don't want to see ourselves as a quitter, right? But sunk cost fallacies, throwing good effort after bad, are fallacies for a reason. A change of direction is sometimes what's required. But how do you know when to invoke Bugs Bunny, take that left turn at Albuquerque, right? Core values. Core values will tell you if you're changing to suit yourself or you're changing to suit others. We all have times when a demand from other people just feels off, right? Something doesn't seem right about it. My general rule of thumb is the more subjective the complaint, the more evidence I need that it's worth listening to. Other times, we know that a criticism someone has of us is accurate. And those times are embarrassing, but the criticism rings true. But sometimes you don't know. You don't know whether they're right. You don't know whether to listen. Or you want to change, but you don't know how, and you don't know which way to go. It's one thing to change a behavior. It's another thing to change who you are. And leaning on your core values is a good way to figure out how to change your behaviors to get better outcomes without changing that core of who you are. Because that's you, right? Before the break, I was talking about a change I had to make because my kindness was being manipulated and taken advantage of. Now, I didn't want to give up the idea that it's best to be kind to other people. But then I realized I'm a person, so I deserve kindness too. That may seem like a really basic revelation, but there you go. So instead of being less kind, I leaned into kindness. The change I made enhanced that core value instead of giving up on it. I decided to change my approach from nice to fair. Similar to the compare and contrast with the core values that I talked about in the example of the two military services, right? Words have a lot in common, but they're not the same thing. Nice isn't necessarily fair to me. What being fair instead of nice meant was starting with people in a position that was more neutral as opposed to actively friendly. Basically having people earn greater access to my time and energy as opposed to just giving it to them by default. That way, I was fair to everyone, including myself, not just nice, right? I gave people fewer chances. I set boundaries better, right? I wasn't nice. I was fair. Things got so much worse before they got better. Now, there was a bright side to that, okay? The bright side was that the abuse and manipulations were now way more obvious because I wasn't catering to people. Manipulative people, and they are out there, will use the things you believe in against you precisely because you believe in them. So if you're honest, they'll accuse you of lying. If you're brave, they'll call you weak. Because people don't like people thinking they're the opposite of what they value. And so when you get called something the opposite of what you value, you throw yourself more and more into a state of imbalance, trying to prove you're the good thing and not the bad thing, right? Now, hopefully it goes without saying that you shouldn't have to change something you like about yourself because of some popularity contest. But maybe there's a way of showing that part of yourself in a way that gets you better results. And that's what my one-on-one services do. But, you can talk to a friend about this as well. You can talk to the people that you feel actually have your back. If you want some extra help with this from me, 289-275-9600, 289-275-9600, or email me at Liana at notherapyshow.com, at Liana, Liana, at notherapyshow.com, or Twitter, Instagram, at notherapyshow. One more break. We're going to come back. A few more final thoughts on core values, what to lean into, what to avoid. Back after this on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back, final segment of this episode of It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kerzner. I'm still not a therapist, and we are still talking core values. Now, I want to touch back on that connection between superheroes and core values I made earlier. One, because it's fun. It's something that's easily understood. It's a common thing. But also because I've found with my one-on-one clients, a lot of people feel that they don't have any worth unless they're as idealized as our favorite Cape Crusader. This is why I have another top 10 phrase here. That idealization, that perfect is a lie. Stop trying to be perfect. Superheroes and other fictional characters were never intended as role models that anyone can completely copy. Can you fly? Can you turn invisible? Exactly. And yet, instead of us seeing the ways in which we are like these heroes, we do what's called an upward social comparison. We compare ourselves in negative ways to these ideals. And that's doing it wrong. Superheroes are extreme examples of what people can do with unique abilities. They're also extreme examples of the trade-offs that you have to make to achieve things. But to me, one of the biggest lessons of superheroes that gets buried far too often is essentially just because you can hit someone doesn't mean you should. The harder you can hit, the more likely you are to really hurt someone if you don't check your swing. And that's why it's really important to know what your strengths are and to connect them to your core values. Because the strengths, the things you can hit really hard on, are the things most likely to hurt people if you're out of sync. As I said earlier, every villain has their reasons. But the difference between a hero and a villain is that villains lose touch with the best parts of themselves. And so they give into their worst instincts. And each one of us can go either way in life. We all have the capacity to be a hero and a villain. I see a lot of people with an instinct to harm others because they believe that's the way of the world. The thinking goes, if they don't hurt other people first, those people will hurt them. I get subjected to a lot of interesting stuff online based on that principle. And every so often, I test someone to see if they can take what they dish out. And of course they can't. These folks, they're trying to be the things that they fear. But that doesn't make anything any less scary for them. If anything, it makes things more scary because it escalates. You're constantly feeding the fear by acting out on it. So earlier, I cautioned listeners on the core value of selflessness. Now I'm going to issue a caution of the core value of strength as well. And this is just to show you that every core value has, a dark side, if you will, a shadow self, to get Jungian, okay? Every single one. And it's important to take the bad with the good. Strength is an example. Strength doesn't have to be about projecting force. That's might. Projecting force, that's might. Strength is about not needing to lash out first, because lashing out is a sign of weakness. A lot of things people do to look strong are anything but. And this is just my personal thing, nothing against the movie. I was pretty disturbed by the way the latest Batman movie had a scene where Batman nearly beat a guy to death while Batman was hopped up on drugs. Yeah, I know. We're supposed to understand that this is the beginning of Robert Pattinson's Batman Bruce Wayne journey in the Matt Reeves film, but too often, not just in this movie, the Batman films forget that Batman's biggest weapon is his brain, not his fists. It drives me crazy how the Batman movies use violence for cheap thrills, then claim it's a metaphor. I mean, a lot of the Batman comics just use violence for cheap thrills. They don't claim anything. The thing is, this claim that the violence is a metaphor, it works. People flock to see these movies. And I flock to see these movies. I always see them on opening weekend. They're pretty good, okay? But that impulse to go grimdark is the reason that DC hasn't been able to make a good Superman movie in a really long time. Now, this is compared to their excellent take on Superman in the show Superman and Lois. And perhaps that's because they can't show as much violence on television. Maybe it's making Superman a dad that gets them to back off on the solving problems with fists angle. But do you notice that Batman is associated with punching people way more than Superman is? And that's because Superman is stronger. He can't just punch some bank robber in the face. He'd smash in their skull with one punch. To me, the modern Batman so often seems desperate, and it's getting really old for me. Yeah, that's deliberate in the Matt Reeves Batman film, which I think is good. I just hope that element doesn't go over people's heads. Real strength, Superman-style strength, is about knowing when not to hit as much as it is being able to hit hard. Because if you really are strong and you lash out, you have to live with how badly you hurt the person you lashed out on. The truly strong don't lash out, at least not very often, precisely because they know the damage they'll cause. So if you believe in strength as a core value, if you want to project strength, don't be a bully. So that's it for this show. All right, next week, I haven't decided what I'm doing yet. So if you've got a suggestion, 289-275-9600. That's 289-275-9600 without me coughing. Or email Liana at notherapyshow.com. That's Liana at notherapyshow.com. Or Twitter, Instagram at notherapyshow. Until next week, while I figure out what I'm doing, you now have the tools to figure out your core values and how to live your best life in accordance with them. Hopefully. Alrighty then. I'm Liana Kerzner. I am not a therapist. This has been It's Not Therapy, and your crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. Go out with those core values intact. Till next time.